Hello and welcome to this week's episode of My Granny is Irish. This week I am joined by Ronan McGreevy from Enemy Territory, the Irish Times. It's we're really grateful to have you on, Ronan. And I should say, just for the benefit of the viewers, that we're recording this on a Friday. That Friday, 2 days before Remembrance Sunday, that will be recognised in Britain, and just under about 5 days from actual Armistice Day, which falls next Wednesday. And Ronan, the reason I wanted to have you on is that you're pretty much an Irish expert in the First World War. Clearly, there's a lot of them. Well, there's quite a few of them in the UK and Britain, but it's unusual, at least on the journey I've been on, to find somebody who's as interested in it as I am, especially also from the Irish point of view. So I think last year you were editor or contributor of what was called the National University of Ireland First World War Centenary Roll of Honour Essays.
hmm
Which was a book that basically put together all of the Irish who had served under for the British in the First World War. And you obviously thought
Well,
that
all
was
the university graduates from NUI, from UCD,
yeah,
UCC, and UCG, and also from Maynooth. Yeah.
yeah. So why did you think it was important to put that book together?
Well, I have Laura. Thanks for having me. I have it's my fourth book on the Irish experience of the First World War. My first book back in 2016 was this one, Wherever the Firing Line Extends: Ireland and the Western Front, and I also published two ebooks based on the Irish Times archives about the Somme and Gallipoli. And this book was a book about the Irish students or alumni from NUI that served in the First World War. What's interesting about the NUI is that you're looking at the middle class Catholic sort of uh, population here. You're talking about a tiny elite in Irish society, the 1% who went to university at that time, and they would have joined the British war effort as it was. And it's very interesting because when you hear about all the Irish who sign up to the First World War, you're reminded of what James Connolly said about that most of the Irish who joined up were as a result of economic conscription. They had no choice, but actually, um, most of the people, all the people who joined from the NUI, they were engineers, they were doctors, they were lawyers, etc. They had everything to lose from joining the British war effort, and 80 of them lost their lives.
Yeah, so if I just stop you there, so because I think we have to be careful in terms of conscription. I think from my school days anyway, I certainly remember conscription was seen as a trigger, certainly towards the War of Independence. People. So
Yeah.
because conscription was brought in, it wasn't brought in immediately. If the war was declared in 1914, I think I'm
Yeah.
right on. So
Yeah,
then
that's right.
in terms in then obviously the Easter Rising here in 1915, and there was threats to bring
16,
in
16.
sorry, the Easter Rising was 1916. But the British didn't bring in conscription, I think, either in Britain or what they would consider obviously the Empire, until I think it was 2 years later. So these Irish soldiers, as I said, serving from the NUI, none of them were conscripted. They all
No,
volunteered.
no, there was no conscription in Ireland. I'm trying to remember, but I think your conscription was brought in the UK in February 1916, if I'm not mistaken, and then it was brought in. Yeah, it was extended to Ireland in March 1918, but it was never implemented because it prompted a ferocious black backlash from
Yes.
nationalist Ireland, and it was regarded as a temporary measure because at that stage the Germans had broken through the Allied lines and there was a moment of extreme peril for the British and the French, but that moment passed, and the British government realised that introducing conscription into Ireland would be more trouble than it's worth. So what I'm saying in essence is that by my calculation, 270,000 Irishmen served in the First World War, and not one of them was a conscript.
So they all volunteered. Okay,
Yeah,
that is really interesting. And I mean, again, so you've written a number of books, but why do you think then they volunteered? Because I've read Niall Ferguson's The Pity of War, and he actually deconstructs a lot of the myths. And I think even when we were again in the Irish education system, we were. And I think it's the same in the British one. There is this idea that the British and, well, pretty much the whole continent were sort of dying for war. There was a lot of jingoism, and
yeah,
that people there were some people who were afraid they would literally miss it, right? It would all be over by
yeah, yeah.
Christmas. But what actually Ferguson says is this isn't the case. That the ordinary people, they may have volunteered, but they were not banging the door down. And this must have been even more so in Ireland. So why do you think then everybody volunteered, and then, well, those who volunteered did so, they didn't have to, and obviously it's for what was considered, an occupying territory. And then maybe again, why, as you say, these middle class, the 1%,
Yeah.
certainly the Irish elite would have volunteered.
Okay, well, I always say there are 270,000 reasons why Irishmen, mostly Irishmen, there were some Irish women as well, so signed up to fight, and that's one for every one of them that did it. But if I could make some broad points, right? First of all, um, we were part of the United Kingdom in 1914, and people kind of forget that. Like, and there was no prospect in 1914 of Irish independence, right? So we were what Scotland and Wales is today. We were separate countries, separate culturally, socially, etc., but we were still part of the UK. And what's really interesting is that from the Act of Union in 1800, the number of Irishmen serving in the British Army never was lower than the percentage, the Irish percentage of the UK population. In other words, back in the 1830s, um, some 60% of the sort of rank and file of the British Army were Irish, and the reason for that was no sense of patriotism or anything. It was a job. It was a job like every other job. You got a pension out of it. You got to travel, etc., etc. And the British Army was very, very well embedded in Ireland. I mean, there were 8 different regiments. There were 4 barracks in Dublin. I mean, you know yourself, Laura, growing up, when you hear about a garrison town, we're not talking about the Irish state. We're talking about going back to the 19th
Yes.
century. Towns like Tralee and Clonmel and Longford, Mullingar, like they're all towns. So, there's a very interesting essay that was done about 20 years ago, in which the writer, his name escapes me, but he'll come back to me. He says that you have to think about that when people joined the British Army, it wasn't the British Army, it was the army.
The
That was
army.
the army of the state. And at the time, and people find that hard to believe because we have our whole vision of Irish history is filtered through republicanism and through the 1916 Rising and so on. But the vast majority of people in Ireland, they weren't dying to be part of the UK, but it was just a reality for them. So that was
Yes.
the main reason why. And at the start of the war, I mean, the Irish population of the UK was about 10%, and they were. Uh, 10% of the more than 10% of the army was Irish, so they were immediately thrust into the fray. And then you had the territorial army at that time, the reserves, the auxiliaries, and they were all called up as well. And then other people, and then you have to remember as well that the Irish leadership at that time, the Irish Parliamentary Party, John Redmond was the leader at the time. He extolled the virtues of fighting in this war, because you have to remember at the time that Belgium, which had been invaded by Germany, and France were both Catholic countries.
I think it's easy to forget, as you say, after the Act of Union, Ireland was seen as Scotland and Wales. It wasn't seen like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or
Mm.
indeed America, which is they're all geographically much further away. We're part of the Union. We're not just a colony or part of the empire. It's
Yeah,
it's it's
yeah,
different. So I guess that, as you say, is a big is a big part of it. Now, if we sort of recap again, perhaps relying on our Leaving Cert history, the whole home rule is bouncing around here. It's I forget when it first became when the Irish in Westminster at the time started demanding it, but it clearly was on the table, I think, under Lloyd George, perhaps 1914, 1915. And I think us Irish like to think it was very close to being passed because and then the First World War, I think we're told, then the First World War broke out, and that was the end of home rule. But I think that's not accurate because it's easy to forget that the Unionists were very much opposed, obviously, to home
Yeah.
rule, and they were armed as well. This wasn't going to be resolved peacefully. So the First World War breaks out, and that obviously changes things for the home rule bill. Did some of them fight, I think, on the promise of home rule, or do you think that maybe is a miss?
Well, if we go back, there were three home rule bills, and the first two fell, one in the 1880s and one in the 1890s. But the third one, basically what happened in 1910, the Irish Parliamentary Party held the balance of power in Westminster, so it was propping up the Liberal government of Herbert Asquith, and their price for supporting the Liberal government was the Home Rule Bill, which was introduced into the UK Parliament in 1912 and was passed in 1914. And basically,
It must have been passed in the House of Commons then, was it?
yeah,
But
and the
not in
House
the
of
House of
Lords. You
Lords.
see, what happened was that previously in 1893 it had been blocked by the House of Lords, but the Irish Parliamentary Party, one of its demands for going into government with the Liberal Party was to get rid of the House of Lords veto. So the House of Lords had so basically the rule was changed that the House of Lords could only veto a bill in 2 years, and then the third year would pass. So in
Yes.
1912 the Home Rule Bill gets passed. 13 and 14, 12, 13, the House of Lords blocks it, and then to 1914, it's due to become law. So what happens in the 1912 is that the UVF is founded, and that's followed the following year by the Irish Volunteers. And the Irish Volunteers even though it becomes synonymous with the IRA in the War of Independence, actually it's there really to defend home rule in the first instance, and obviously the UVF is opposed to home rule. So what we have in July 1914, as the crisis as UK as Europe is counting down to war, we have a conference in Buckingham Palace between the Unionists and the Nationalists. They don't resolve the issue, and John Redmond says that he under sufferance, he says that he will allow Ulster to opt out of home rule, but only for a period of 6 years. So all of this is not been resolved at all. And then bang, in August 1914, the war breaks out, and everything is put on hold. But the important thing is that in September 1914, the Home Rule Act, as it is now, is given royal assent and it's put on the statute books. But in agreement for that, John Redmond agrees that the Home Rule Act will be suspended for the duration of the war, and there's a fatal presumption, as it turned out, that the war is going to be short, it'll be over within a year, and then the Home Rule Act will be implemented. And this is the background to all of this. So in September 1914, when John Redmond asked the Irish Volunteers to sign up to fight for Britain, 93% of them side with him, and the 7% don't, and it's the 7% that ends up staging the Easter Rising and forms the basis of the IRA and the War of Independence.
So, I mean, it's incredibly interesting in a way because I'm perhaps like you are part of the what if this, didn't happen? What if America never won that War of Independence? How would that have changed things? So it is possible then to think, I had forgotten about the 6-year pause. Ronan even got an incredible memory. But again, when I was rereading Noel Ferguson's The Pity of War, he concludes by saying that war was certainly not inevitable for Britain, and that in fact it was the greatest error in modern history. But it's in so if they hadn't gone caught into that, what he thinks is really a continental border dispute, and it never happened. Do you think then the Home Rule Bill is lying there? It's got royal assent. I mean, it'd be interesting to think then if they waited the 6 years. Do you think Home Rule would have been extended to the all of the whole island, or do you think partition was inevitable because of the
Yeah, that's
numbers
good.
in Northern Ireland?
That's a good question. Well, Keith Jeffreys, the late great historian, said that the seminal event in modern Irish history is not the Easter Rising, it's the First World War, because the First World War is a catalyst for everything that follows. So if the UK had stayed out of the First World War, right, so what you would have had is, if they had been able to stay out for argument's sake, yeah, of course, there would be the Home Rule Act would have come into being. Ulster would have stayed out of it. But what you could have had instead was, this period of 6 years, you could have had unrest in the north with the UVF agitating and maybe getting involved in saber rattling. But what you could have had not only was a civil war in Ireland between nationalists and unionists over the whole thing of home rule, but you could have also have it could have spread to being a UK-wide civil war, because if you go back to 1914, you might have heard of the Curragh Mutiny. This was this was a putative order that, basically British officers based in the Curragh camp were asked, um, if we have to impose home rule on Ulster, will you obey lawful orders? And they said no. We'd rather resign our commissions. So basically, you could have a situation where not only are nationalists fighting unionists, but you have two branches of the British Army facing off against each other. One that's determined to implement the will of the government and to introduce home rule to the whole of Ireland, and the other that's determined to side with the UVF and resist it. And I mean, I have a book on the assassination of Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, and Wilson was the head of the British Army during the First World War, and he was very much on the side of the Ulster Unionists. So all I can say is, Laura, the history of Ireland would have been completely different
Yes.
if the UK had stayed out of the First World War.
Yeah. Well, I think the history of Europe, right? I mean, we some get, I guess you could say that that's a narrow way of looking. Obviously, the history of the entire continent
Yeah.
would be completely different if Britain had managed to stay out. But I mean, it is fascinating. I think in terms of the other thing, I mean, as I feel bound to say, is of course the big saying that all of us remember is that Ulster opposed home rule because they said
Yeah.
home rule was Rome rule. And
Yeah.
I think looking back, especially the folks down there at the Irish Times who have been telling us we've been living in a theocracy for the previous 30 years. I mean,
Yeah.
were they wrong on that, right? They ultimately, again, if you turn on the documentary section of RTE or the opinion section of the Irish Times, they would say that actually they were right on that home rule did turn into Rome rule, or at least certainly a huge amount of the welfare state was outsourced to the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. The question is then, if you had a united Ireland under British rule, say the UK, right? So John Bruton used to make the point that he was very anti the whole sort of the Irish. He was very anti sort of 1916 and all that followed. He thought that if Home Rule had been implemented for all of Ireland, it would have uh, taken the edges off the sort of
Yes.
extremism on both sides. That Ulster Unions wouldn't have been able to have behaved the way they did towards the nationalist community, and vice versa, right? So the British would never have allowed a sort of what happened with the Catholic Church in Ireland post independence. So you're looking at I mean, yeah, you're right up to a point,
Well, I guess
So
I guess what we'd say is that let's say for some reason assume the Second World War would have happened. Obviously, more Irish would have fought in that, and then even say take the NHS, which came in I think 49. You assume then that would have been also available in the south, which cuts all Catholic influence out of
Yeah.
healthcare, perhaps the
Yeah. Yeah.
schools, and as you say, so it may well be that Britain was right on that. But anyway, it didn't happen like that, unfortunately,
Yeah.
and the Great War did occur, and with devastating devastating element or
Consequences. Yeah.
impact on the entire continent. And as you said before, I think again, just citing some numbers again, this was from Ferguson: 9 million from the British point of view. 9 million were killed, and I think it took out essentially 4 different empires, and
Yeah.
generating a lot of territorial disputes, which perhaps you can get into now. So the British Empire, if not totally destroyed, was obviously completely watered down.
Yeah.
And Russia turned communist, and I think it finished off the Anglo or the Austro-Hungarian
Yeah.
Empire and the Ottoman Empire. Am I
Yeah.
right on that? So it's
Yeah.
taken down
All of those. Yeah.
pretty much all 4. And if you say, I think you said to me beforehand, you can trace back a number of what are essentially territorial disputes ongoing now in
Yeah.
2025 to that declaration of war
Yeah.
in 1914.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I consider this a bit like, the Big Bang Theory. You have this singularity, and then it explodes, and the universe keeps expanding till the end of time. That to me is that the shot that was fired at Sarajevo that killed the Archduke Ferdinand. That shot still resonates around the world. I mean, you cannot understand the modern world without understanding the First World War, importance of it. Everything changed, and
Yeah,
you look around the map of Europe. I counted about 18 different countries that wouldn't exist but for the First World War. Poland didn't exist. Finland didn't exist. Czechia, the Slovakia, Hungary, Austria. And then you go on to the Middle East, and you have all those countries with their sort of artificially drawn borders. Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, all these countries, they owe their borders to the First World War. And people forget as well. You're talking about the alternative history of Ireland. There'd be no Irish state without the First World War, and because the 1916 Rising happened as a result of the First World War, and there's a very good essay that Gareth Fitzgerald wrote in 2006. Uh, in the Irish Times, and I would recommend anybody read it. He did that kind of what if we had stayed with Britain
yeah,
rather than and sought for independence. And his point was that in the 1920s we'd still be trying to figure things out. 1930s, the Great Depression. Nobody wants to be an independent country in the middle of the Great Depression. The 40s, you have the Second World War. Who wants to do that? Then you have the introduction of the welfare state in the UK. You have the NHS, you have free education, and who wants to get rid of that in the 1940s? And then you could be looking at the 1960s before the Irish even get around to thinking about it. So, um, his point was that we struck at just the right time, just the right amount of weakness that the UK had, to get our independence, or at least the 26 counties did. And so, like, when I say the First World War is absolutely critical to our understanding of the modern world, the 2 biggest conflicts in the world at the moment we know are the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine was established as a state in 1918, very short-lived, right up to 1921. Then it was incorporated into the Soviet Union, and then, of course, the Balfour Declaration in 1917, establishing a homeland for the Jews, is the basis of, to a certain
yes.
extent,
I
all of
guess
the modern conflict.
just recap on, so because the British mandate exists, I never understand what the difference between a man. Britain at the time was ruling Palestine, and then the Balfour Declaration is made.
Yeah, so what happens is that before the First World War, the Ottoman Empire owns most of the Middle East, right up into North Africa. So, Britain, except Egypt. Egypt is a colony of Britain at that time. So
Yeah,
in 1917, the British actually capture Palestine as it was then, and the idea is that post the First World War, that the French and the British would divvy up the Middle East according to mandates. Now, mandates are different from annexations. So basically, that they would run these countries on behalf of the locals who live there, because these countries didn't have any self-rule before that. I mean, they're all part of this amorphous
So
thing
they
called the
don't have a
Ottoman Empire.
British, they don't have a British civil service. And with it the case now that the British have understood that they shouldn't interfere with the local traditions and customs as
Yeah,
much as they had previously, I guess.
yeah, yeah. So that was it. So they were a mandate wasn't. It was a League of Nations mandate. It was essentially, we look after these countries till they can look after themselves. That was the idea.
Okay, so
And
it's
so
still a
you
kind of paternalistic view of it,
Yeah,
of
it
the
was.
natives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then you have like the likes of Iraq becomes an independent country in 1920. I mean, the British take over that. It's a disaster. They leave. I mean, the British are withdrawing from a lot of these places, and then Lebanon is a French mandate, and then you've Jordan, you've Syria, all these places, and all those kind of jaggedy marks on the map. I mean, they're arbitrary.
Yeah.
They're arbitrary lines drawn by the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1917. So when you look around the Middle East today, I mean,
Yes.
it's still this
The boundaries are artificial as much as you can say, and that the empire, I think, was always marked in pink, and there's
yeah,
less and less pink on the globe now, coming in certainly when after Armistice Day in 1916. So I mean, as you say, it's critical, the influence that the First World War has had. And I'm always interested in, I'm interested in huge, in the impact historically on just how the future of a country might be. But I think also, again, I think it's interesting, Ronan, that the First World War, even maybe more than the Second World War, still dominates even popular culture. The books or the historical fiction books are often still First World War. Even children's books like War
yeah,
Horse, for instance, which was
yeah,
huge and made into you can see it in the West End. I
yeah,
read it with my
yeah,
son. Um, Obviously, Netflix have just done All Quiet on the Western Front. I
yeah,
actually ended up rewatching Birdsong, which is a Sebastian Faulks novel, and also the BBC made a drama out of it starring Eddie Redmayne, and you can watch it on Netflix. And it's just, those you could pick one human story out of it, and I think it still really dominates the memory. And both you lived in the UK for, I think, nearly 10 years, and I lived there for twice that, for
hmm
20 years. And I think it's worth just talking about how it still, I think, dominates the UK, the British consciousness still over there. Again, perhaps even more than World War Two. And I
hmm
think World War Two was very much seen as, it clearly was a victory, and a moral victory. And even though they were on the winning side in World War One, I think now, for good or for ill, the general feel when I was living there anyway was it wasn't really worth the loss. I mean, you
No, it
talked
wasn't.
about how it was the elite from, these are the NUI graduates, and we'll talk
Yeah,
about
yeah,
maybe the loss of those, even those 80 to Ireland must have been. And it's often said that, the officer class was wiped out in World War One. And for me at least, everywhere you go, from the train stations to a college in Cambridge, all of them have a plaque
yeah.
marking remembering those who died in the First World War. What was your feeling when you were living over there for 10 years?
Well, I think that you're absolutely spot on with your analysis there, Laura. I mean, the Second World War, obviously, that was a really big part of British culture as well. With the dam busters, and it's kind of regarded as Britain's finest hour, literally and metaphorically. I mean, you have them standing alone in 1940. There's an obvious bogeyman here in Hitler and Nazism and all the rest,
Yes.
and the British were on the winning side in the Second World War. But why? But I think one of the things that people uh, fail to see is that the First World War was a disaster for the UK. I mean, they lost, in terms of the actual deaths, it's something in the order of 900,000 for the UK, right? And it's 420,000 or even less than that for, well, it's still a huge number for the Second World War. But then you have to understand that the 70 to 90,000 of them are civilians. So in effect, the First World War was 3 times as deadly for the British as the Second World War. And that's the first thing people consider. And then of course you have the maiming and that. I mean, for every man who died, there were two who are severely injured and traumatized, and obviously PTSD and all the rest of that sort of stuff. So the First World War is a terrible tragedy for all the countries involved because it didn't have to happen. And you're right, the British didn't have to participate in it. If the British cabinet sitting down on the 3rd of August 1914 were to be told that 4 years later
Yeah.
900,000 men would be dead, they wouldn't have. Of course, they wouldn't have entered the First World War. But none of the countries should have entered the First World War. Should never have happened. And there's a great book called The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark where he talks about all the protagonists involved. They had all the reasons for entering the war,
Yeah.
but none of them were the right reasons. They all entered out of fear rather than any sense of triumph. And that's why I think the First World War still has a grip on the public imagination, because it's the sheer tragedy of it, the sheer wastefulness of it. Whereas with the
Yes.
Second World War, you know that you were fighting an existential battle for Western civilization. It's not as clear cut in the First World War, I think.
No, I mean, I think again, Ferguson earlier on in his book said that it was he says that it was the worst thing that Britain had ever had to endure, which I thought was interesting because, the Blitz occurred during World War II where they were dropping
Yeah,
bombs on civilians in
yeah.
London, but it was World War One that was considered,
Oh yeah,
the worst thing that they had to endure. And I mean, I remember, I just think you can tell us about the tour of the Western Front in a minute, but I think, when you see, I don't watch a lot of TV, as you can imagine, but I definitely think watching World War, any of those wars that are set in World War One, just to bring home the it is a cliche, the absolute fertility of the Western
yeah,
Front.
yeah.
And as I said, the total tragedy of it. I think I remember watching, what was it? Well, this spoiler alert for the viewers. I think it was a testament to youth,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
which is Vera Britton, I think, is the
That's
nurse in
right.
it,
Yeah.
and her I just about remembered her brother serves, and she actually she manages to save him once. I mean, practically resurrects him from the dead, and they put him back together again, and of course send him out onto the front. I think a few months later, and he gets killed. And and again, they were, I think, the elite. They were from a very well-to-do family, and you just think, like, God, I mean, how angry would you be if you had done that? You'd essentially saved your brother from the clutches of war, of death, and he ended up dying anyway. And certainly, we're used to seeing it from the British point of view, but All Quiet on the Western Front is, it's an amazing book and
Yeah.
film, and that is from the German point of view, and how, again, towards the end of the war, I think it was due to mass surrender of the German soldiers, which eventually is what brought the armistice to an end. Um,
Mm.
but there's Passchendaele as well. I think 20,000 officers or 20,000 soldiers were killed on the first day in the Somme. But
Yeah.
the one difference between, I think, the French and the British, and it's why the French pushed for such a harsh treaty at the Treaty of Versailles over from the British, is that the war was fought on their territory,
That's
on
right.
on their land. Again, I think you forget that if you're living in Ireland. It's bad enough to lose all of these men. You sent them off to war, both the officer class and the working class. But to have I think it was a phrase, to have your soil, they were going to bleed them white
Yeah.
or bleed them red, was the
Yeah.
German tactic on the Western Front, is different because you always have that territory. It's always there as a reminder. And you said you wrote a book about it, and you also do a tour every year, is it?
Yeah, so I do I wrote this book, Wherever the Firing Line Extends, which I published in 2016. So this was out of a tour I did at the Western Front in 2014 at the start of the war. And I drove around, and what I found was really remarkable is the number of Irish memorials there are there. I mean, it's a whole architectural heritage, and some of the biggest, most impressive memorials on the Western Front are Irish, including, like, you might have heard of the Ulster Tower, the Island of Ireland Peace Park, the grave of Willie Redmond, all these places, they're just amazing. It's amazing architectural heritage. So I decided I would write a book about that based on the memorials that are there. So the first shot memorial, the very first shot that the British fired in the First World War, is on the 21st of August 1914, and there's a plaque there, and that the guy who fired that shot was with an Irish cavalry regiment, right? And the last plaque on the 11th of November 1918, when the British entered the town of Mons in Belgium. There's a plaque to the 5th Royal Irish Lancers, right? So the whole war, I mean, the Irish are there the whole way through it, and so I was thinking that this is an amazing heritage, and nobody had written this type of a book before. So I basically told the story of the Irish on the Western Front through all of these memorials that are there. And in fact, even since the book has been published, there's been a lot more of those memorials. And when you go there, you realize, like, this was our war too, you know, and that was never clear to me when I was in school. I don't know about you, Laura, but
No.
we were never told about the Irish experience in the First World War. I mean, it was a complete omerta. And
Aye.
I mean, it's totally bizarre that the First World War is the biggest war that the Irish were ever involved in, and yet it wasn't taught in the school system, and I don't believe it's taught nowadays either. I
No,
picked up a book.
yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry, carry on. Yeah,
No, and those soldiers, can you explain to me when, because I think the Irish who served in the British Army, well, I think Irish who left the Irish Army for the Second World War and served in the British Army were treated
yeah,
very badly when they
when
were
they came back.
returned.
Yeah,
What happened? We won't get into that. But so what happened then when those soldiers who survived, returned from the war? Then in 1918, it's still you're still part of the Union. The Free State haven't
yeah.
hit until 1922, but. Oh, we must be in the middle of the Civil War. How are things for them, the soldiers who have served and survived the trenches when they return
Well,
to Ireland?
to Ireland. Well, it's there's something of a myth that has arisen over the years that they came back and they were all shunned and they were all ostracized from Irish society. There weren't, because for the simple reason there's just too many of them. I mean, you're talking about 200,000 men that come back from the front. They're in every street, they're in every town, they're in every village. They're a very important part of Irish society. And what happens is that during the War of Independence, an awful lot of them signed up to fight with the IRA. The most famous example, of course, being Tom Barry, who led the Kilmichael ambush in 1920. And then you have, there's something like 30% of the IRA's officer cadre in the War of Independence were ex-British Army. I mean, you think of, yeah,
Well,
Emmett.
why have they done that, do you think? Sorry, I don't want to, turn into a psychologist. I mean, I would have thought that's difficult, or did they'd seen enough and they'd had enough, and they've
Yeah,
said, oh, well, this was, we've already wasted, so many people were wasted, or the British
yeah.
government don't know what we're doing. Actually, you know what? Maybe I will take my chances on my own with the Free State. Do you think that was the thinking?
Yeah, well, there would have been an element of mercenary saying, God, like, I've just come home, and what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I'm going to be on the side of the good. But a lot of them, you see, a lot of them, there was no patriotic ardor in a lot of them when they signed up to fight the First World War. A lot of them, it was an adventure, it was
Yeah,
something to do. And
yeah,
like, we're talking about Ireland 1914, there wasn't a huge amount to do. And then they come back and they think, like, what was it all for? And lots of countries were like this. I mean, lots of people came back from the war and turned against the governments that had sent them there. And you looked,
yes,
and that happened in Germany and other countries. So the likes of Tom Barry, and that, he said, I wasn't really aware of my national conscience until the 1916 Rising. He was actually serving in Mesopotamia at the time, and he reads about the Easter Rising, and suddenly this opens his dam burst of national fervor about him, and he says, I didn't know about my own country's history until the 1916 Rising. And a lot of them would have been like that. Now, in terms of the others, I mean, there was there was a big attempt made by the Irish state actually to integrate the soldiers that came back. For instance, the William Hickey, who was the general in charge of the 16th Irish Division, was made a senator in the Irish Free State, as was Brian Cooper, who had been an officer involved, and he went on to be a TD in Sligo. John Redmond's son, Major William Redmond, ended up becoming a TD in Waterford, and his wife took over the seat in 1932, and she held it till 1945. So a lot of them would have, would have come back and integrated into Irish society. Others, of course, were targeted. Now, there's a big debate as to whether or not there was a lot of whether or not the IRA targeted ex-British soldiers during the War of Independence. There's a lot of debate about that. Yes, a lot of ex-soldiers were killed, but the question is, were they killed because they were ex-British soldiers, or were they regarded as having been spies? And I suppose the historical consensus is that they were targeted because they were spies.
And I mean, of course, the other thing that we certainly all know about from our school days is an overspill from the First World War is the Black and Tans,
Yeah,
then ex British military who were sent
yeah.
to put down rebellions. I mean, this again, on the one hand, on one minute they're fighting the French they're fighting the Germans in the trenches, and now they're over in Germany and have carried out some really brutal reprisals, right? I mean,
Yeah.
in the south.
It did, yeah, and this is the thing. I mean, when I talk about there not having been Irish independence, but for the First World War, right? So if first of all, the 1916 Rising wouldn't have happened but for the First World War. It was an event that happened in the First World War. We have always got the impression that it just happened in 1916. No, it
Yes.
didn't. I mean, the rebels elicited the support of Germany. I mean, you're reading the proclamation about the gallant allies. Obviously, the Germans sent Roger Casement. They sent weapons on the Odd, etc., and which was sunk, but. And the reason why the British executed all the leaders was because it was a wartime situation. If you go back to 1867 with the rebellion, they didn't execute any of the leaders because they knew that would create martyrs. So to go back to the Black and Tans, absolutely. I mean, the British when the War of Independence broke out in 1919, the British considered it just as sort of they didn't consider it to be a war at all. So basically, they sent over the auxiliaries
They weren't
to
worried at
support.
first. They didn't think they'd be
No,
successful.
no, they didn't think. So when the independence, so when the first Dáil met in 1919, January 1919, the British were preoccupied with the Treaty of Versailles. They didn't take the whole thing seriously at all in 1919. It's in 1920 that the IRA really start in earnest, burning barracks and targeting the RIC. Then the British bring in the auxiliaries. Now, these are the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. These are ex-British soldiers who have nothing to do, basically, and they're not. They're not soldiers as such. They're seconded to the RIC to which is in the front line of the British response to the War of Independence. So they're basically auxiliary policemen as opposed to soldiers. But the thing is that in terms of the War of Independence, the reason why it's relatively bloodless, relatively short. I mean, it only lasts for really a year and a half from 1920. 1919 doesn't count. Is that the British are sick of war, and
Yeah.
they're sick of being they want peace. They want to be able to concentrate on trying to build up their country after the 1918 war. They're broke and they're in bad odor with the Americans over what happened. So if there had been no First World War, if they hadn't suffered the carnage that they did, they could have done what they did in the Troubles and just tough it out for 25 years as they did. But
Yeah.
because they were in such a bad state after the First World War, they said, we can't do this anymore,
Well,
and
I think the empire as a whole is fraying, and I think it's losing support just from the ordinary, the ordinary British person on the street. Like what's in it for them, kind of thing. And look, empires by definition are going to be hard to rule. Okay, especially when it's
yeah,
so vast. Although obviously geographically Ireland should be easier because it's closer. And no, it was always the case that the leaders of the Rising wanted to exploit the British weakness being
yeah,
at war.
yeah,
But it was the insurgency, I think, from Michael. You can't beat a colonial power generally on a face-to-face battle. It has to be an
No.
insurgency. And Collins executed that militarily, very, very well. And as you say, then the British are done with this. They want this off the plate. And we might as well just finish it just because it's interesting, because it's the one Winston Churchill, of course, then who brings Collins into Downing Street
Yeah.
and says, and they thrash out the treaty together. That's what resolves it. Anyway, from the British point of view, of course, the civil war in Ireland is still to come. So Churchill served. Of course, he had a checkered history in the First World War because he was responsible for, well, they say he was responsible for you're going to tell me
Gallipoli, yeah.
So he was responsible for Gallipoli. He wanted to break the stalemate at the First World War. He saw the trench warfare for the horrific waste it was. And some people say Churchill was wrongly blamed for Gallipoli, that the generals had waited. Actually, the plan itself could have worked if they had moved quicker, and the generals had waited too long, and that's why Gallipoli was such a disaster. Churchill, I think, resigns from his position and serves. He serves in the First World War, and he's going to enter his wilderness years. But before that, he sorts out this dispute in Ireland. Now, obviously, Churchill, an loves the empire, was raised at the peak under Victorian times, but he, I guess, always a pragmatist, and he settles this treaty with Michael Collins at Downing Street. And my understanding was always the relations were quite good between them.
Between Winston Churchill and
Collins, yeah.
Oh, 100% they were, yeah. I mean, they were two sort of maverick individuals who cut a lot of corners, and Churchill was devastated when Michael Collins died, actually. He was genuinely devastated. And what's interesting about the whole treaty negotiations is that at that time, like, you have the creme de la creme of British society. You have Lloyd George, you have Birkenhead, you have Churchill, but the biggest star of the Anglo-Irish talks, as far as the media is concerned, is Michael Collins, because he's this romantic figure who was brought the British to heel, and everybody was mesmerised by him. I mean, Churchill was mesmerised by him, Lady Lavery was mesmerised by him, and so they had a very good relationship. And
I think he said to him, because when Churchill escaped during a previous colonial war in Africa,
the Boer War,
there was an award for him. They put out a reward for recapturing him, and he said to Collins, well, the reward for me being captured was a lot less than the reward for you being captured.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What does what does that say about you? And that's interesting. I never knew that he was genuinely devastated to hear Collins was assassinated. How many years later was it? Your grasp is so
22. So Michael Collins was killed in August 1922.
Okay.
By which time Churchill was already out of politics, because he lost a by-election in Dundee or somewhere like that, and he left the Liberal Party, and those were his wilderness years after I think 1922.
Yeah, I don't think he goes back in. I forget when he gets re-elected as an MP. Maybe it was 35, because he's certainly making speeches against Hitler for a number of years in the House of Commons before 39.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, just turning to that then, I do feel like I'm subjecting you to exams. So one of the reasons, the British went into the war, or certainly I suspect the generals got them into the war, was they were afraid of German rearmament. And of course, the biggest rearmament we know for Versailles was a treaty that pretty much everybody blames now as one of the reasons for World War II. And, the German rearmament is essentially only delayed up until, and they're rearming right into the 30s. So the armistice is signed on the 11th of November 1918, I think. Am I right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So what is your view of the Treaty of Versailles? Was it harsh, or is actually that just us all adopting later Nazi propaganda as an excuse to start World War II again?
Yeah, I would go for the latter.
Interesting.
So the British, the Russians surrendered in 1917, and the Germans imposed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on them, and it was a lot harsher in terms of the territories that the Russians were to lose. That that treaty was obviously overturned when the Germans lost the First World War. But I mean, they had imposed very, very severe terms on Russia's. I don't think it's necessarily to blame for the Second World War. I think what
I mean,
happened,
the
the reason
losers in general, if you lose a war, you don't get
you
to
have to pay.
dictate the terms of victory, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's
that's
right.
not
Yeah,
how it
yeah,
goes.
yeah. I mean, people think
Yeah.
about the reparations and that, like they were never. I mean, I'm not an expert on this period, but from what I recall, they were really a token sort of, oh, we'll punish them. They actually never paid the money they were supposed to pay, right? I mean, the problem for Germany after the First World War is the fact that they were defeated, and not the Treaty of Versailles as such. They were defeated, and uh, you had this theory, of course, the stab in the back that Hitler was able to weaponize in the 1930s to get elected to power in Germany. But I mean, it wasn't an exceptionally harsh treaty at all. I mean, it like, if you think about the fact that two
Well,
million
we were
French.
definitely, well, yeah, I mean, we were definitely, Ronan, for what it's worth, thought that this was a super harsh treaty, and this was one of the reasons why the Germans, were, well, justified was never used, but this was a motivating factor for the Second World War, which I think, looking back, is just does sound like, a piece of Nazi propaganda. The stab in the back, of course, being that it was all the fault of the Jews, right? That they were the ones that
Yeah,
made
the
them.
Bolsheviks and the Jews, and
Yeah,
that was it. I don't think that by most treaty standards it was harsh. No, John Maynard Keynes, who was at the Treaty of Versailles, he was one of those people who said this is far too harsh on Germany. And in fact, as well, the Americans were saying, actually, the British and the Americans were saying, well, look, let's just try and let bygones be bygones here. But it was
brilliant.
the French. I mean, the French, this is the second time their territory has been invaded. They lose 2 million men killed in the First World War from a population that's smaller than the UK, right? And
And
then
as we
30%.
said, it's on their territory, right? It's all
Yeah.
across literally
So
the Western front.
so they are absolutely determined to exert their pound of flesh. And would you blame
Yeah.
them? So
Yeah,
I don't think it, but
I think if all of Brighton, right, had been sort of pounded into submission and had, miles and miles of trenches, the British probably would have felt differently.
yeah, exactly. And also, if you can imagine, like we will all talk about for the occupation of France during the Second World War. People forget that a large swathe of France was occupied in the First World War, and it was really, really harsh circumstances. I mean, the Germans sent a lot any able-bodied men they could find to Germany to work in the mines and so on, and there was a lot of executions happened behind enemy lines. In fact, I one of the chapters in my book is about this village of Iran, where there was 6 Irish soldiers who were captured and executed during the First World War. So I mean, it's called the Great Silence. That time during the First World War, when France was occupied. So I mean, from the French point of view. It's
Yes.
absolutely totally understandable how they why they wanted to impose harsh terms on Germany.
Yeah, difficult neighbours to have, at least on the last 100 years, having the Germans right on your, well, more or
Yeah,
less on your, not
yeah,
not easy. Not easy. But we, to sort of take it up to contemporary times, then, if we want, we talked about how it still, holds a massive sway in the
yeah.
British consciousness. It's going to be Remembrance Sunday.
Mm.
This Sunday, always, probably the
Big
most
event, yeah.
important time in terms of having the monarch there. And I know you were in, as we said, you were in the UK for 10 years. I was there for 20, and it's interesting, isn't it? The very, very worst thing you can do, I think, in British politics for the month of November, or at least coming up to Remembrance Sunday, is not wearing your poppy.
Hmm.
Um, if you don't wear your poppy, you are, and nobody he would dare not do it, even on the Labour benches, and I assume not even the Green Party. So, and I genuinely think there's always a little skirmish every year because there's somebody somewhere, usually Irish, living in the UK, and they're not wearing the poppy. And this, I'm wearing my poppy, but you're not even, which is interesting. You can maybe
Well,
tell
look
me,
at the colours I have on.
yeah,
These are deliberate.
yeah. And there, I was in the north there a few weeks ago, and the British Legion were selling their poppies in Tesco. And it should be noted actually that, when you buy a poppy, the funds go to the British Legion, which essentially look after the. Actually, that was one question. We're going to pull the poppy. So the Irish who fought in the First War and came back here, did they
Yeah.
receive a pension? Did they receive a
Oh
British
yeah,
pension?
yeah, absolutely. They
After,
did.
even after 1922?
Oh yeah, yeah, right up until, and you know what was interesting as well is that the British built thousands of houses in this country. I mean, in my hometown of Carrick-on-Shannon, there's 9 houses just up the road from me that were built by the British under the Soldiers and Sailors Act. So if you go to
Okay.
Killester Garden Village, that was all built by the British. So the British built thousands of houses for ex British servicemen in Ireland. They would have got a pension from the British government. I can tell you, for instance, I interviewed Micheál Martin about this. Two of his uncles were served in the British Army in the Second World War. He said that his father was reared on a British Army pension, and so were so many
Interesting.
other families in Ireland. So they would have got that, and then they would have got. You had the likes of Leopardstown Hospital, which still existed well into independence, looking after Irish veterans of the First World War. So it's very interesting that even though obviously Ireland became an independent country, the British still operated in a big way in this country in terms of the British Legion,
Yes.
looking after British soldiers who had fought in the war. So
Yeah, and just if we just, I'll go back to Bobby. If we contrast that, then what was the treatment then Irish soldiers who had served under, who had left? I think it's right to say who'd left the Irish Army after during World War Two, served with the British and came back, because they were. I mean, it was that was they were shunned, and it wasn't just socially. The government took against them as
yeah, I
well,
know the
didn't they?
government took actions against them, and that they were banned basically from state employment and etc. I think they were pardoned by Alan Shatter, weren't they? Back in the couple of years back, was it? I think that was the
Okay.
case, wasn't it? Yeah, so they
All
were
right.
they were they were given sort of posthumous pardons. And it's interesting as well that there's always this debate about Ireland being neutral in the Second World War, but actually, while the government was neutral, the people were neutral. I mean, you still had over 70,000 men from the Free State or
Yes.
the Irish state who served in the British Army. So there's a long, long tradition of service in the British Army, which
Yes.
still exists to this day. I mean, the Irish Guards, for instance, has
Yeah.
a lot of
It's
men
always
from
one of my
from the
favorite
south end.
photo ops is when
Yeah,
the Princess of Wales does St.
yeah,
Patrick's Day with the Irish Guard. She always
yeah,
looks just really magnificent. But in
yeah. She
terms of the
does. Yeah,
poppy, then yeah, there's always someone somewhere. Not always. You can explain then what was the. I did see it in the Irish Times, although I haven't seen any of it in the British media. I think it's an Irish footballer.
yeah. Katie McCabe. She's the Irish football captain. Um, she's with Arsenal. Like she's a brilliant footballer, but she has chosen this year not to wear a poppy, and she has said that the reason for that is that she doesn't want to have any symbols on her shirt. And
Yes.
and this has, in fact, Laura, this was raised in the British media first by the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, and it ended up in GB News, and then it ended up in the Irish News. And this is a perennial issue, and it's a really tedious one. I mean, it started with James McLean about 10 or 15 years ago. James McLean is from Derry. He refuses to wear the poppy. And he has made a principle of that every year. So every year he doesn't wear the poppy, and every year people say he's not wearing his poppy. But
Yeah.
I remember speaking to the Royal when I was in the area with the Irish Times. I spoke to the Royal British Legion about this, and they support James McLean and they support Katie McCabe. They say that wearing the poppy is a voluntary gesture,
Yes,
and
of
that if a
course.
person
Yeah.
doesn't want to wear it, they
Well, I
shouldn't
mean,
have
it,
to
it
wear it.
is. Yeah, I think that's true, and I should say I think if you ask somebody on it's a story the media like, but if you ask somebody over there, I doubt, they may not even know about it. I mean, to me, if I was to get sort of academic about it, it clearly would be a case of compelled speech. I mean, I don't think you should be compelled to wear, the rainbow flag, your
Yeah,
poppy, or your Black Lives Matter stuff. All of this stuff. These are choices, that you should be able to make. I think the thing about the poppy is just looking at the image here is that it seems to be really sewn quite prominently into the jersey. So,
yeah, that's
the
right. Yeah,
football, they have to go and produce another one that doesn't have. It's not that
yeah,
it's something sort of discreet on the
yeah,
armband. But I tell you, you'll never ever. It's certainly the case. I don't think there are any politicians, or maybe there's sort of five, not even five, but I would struggle to name any British politicians that do not that fit, of course, in the House of Commons, that do not wear their poppy. It's always seen as it would be seen as a sort of a PR disaster. I think it's the
yeah.
Department of whatever it is, the communications guides wouldn't like that. Um, but yeah, it's certainly. And I forget, Ronan, is Remembrance Sunday marked now in Ireland? I thought
Oh
they.
yeah, it has been
Yeah,
for
it has
so.
been for a while.
Oh yeah, it has, no, it always has been. So the big event every year is in St. Patrick's Cathedral, and I'm going to go on Sunday. And
Okay,
what's interesting about it is that in the early 1990s, when Mary Robinson became president, she asked, could she go? And she was turned down by, I think it was Charles High. But in 93, she went anyway.
okay,
And ever since then, the president of Ireland goes to the commemoration day, and also the Taoiseach makes his business to go to Enniskillen, obviously because of the Remembrance Day bomb, etc., etc. So,
yes,
I mean, Remembrance Sunday is now an event in Ireland, thank God, uh, and it always will be from now on. And I have to say that there was a great sea change in Irish attitudes towards the Irish who fought in the First World War in the 1990s, and I would praise two Irish presidents for that. Mary Robinson and Mary McAleese also made her business to remember the Irish, and obviously also my erstwhile colleague and your contributor Kevin Myers showed a great deal of moral courage in the 1980s and 1990s of raising this issue and saying, listen, there's so many people, there's so many stories out of this. We can't afford to ignore this
yes.
anymore. And he's done a great job in resurrecting the memory of the Irish who fought in the First World War.
Yes, yeah. No, I think that's right. I think the anniversary of the Enniskillen bombing actually falls this Saturday, I believe, and
Yeah.
was just a day before. Look, we only have a few minutes left, although I'm going to end on a quote from All Quiet on the Western Front. But before that, I did notice, and it's a slight change, but some of our viewers might be interested to know I saw you help launch a book on the Taoiseach. That
Yeah.
was actually edited by a well-known Irish viewers probably wouldn't
British
know him,
boy.
but I know him very well. A
Yeah.
English broadcaster, Ian Dale. So you can
Yeah.
give us quick summary of that one then.
Yeah, it's a really good book. So it's a book. So he has a podcast series of podcasts on British kings and queens and British prime ministers, U.S. presidents. And it's really good. I mean, he's a great broadcaster, as you know. And he did one on the Irish Taoiseachs, basically off his own bat because he said he knew very little about Ireland. And once he had done that, it was popular enough that he thought, well, I'll do a book on it. And he couldn't find an Irish publisher for some bizarre reason. So he's basically got this book which is the very first book, which is profiles of all the Taoiseach, and it's
Yeah, it's
really well
incredible
written.
that it hasn't been
Yeah,
done
it's
before, right?
incredible that a book like this has to be produced. So I mean, it's got a lot of it's got basically very prominent. It's got all the prominent political scientists written about it, writing in it, and I read through it. I think the profiles in it are very fair. They're very informative, and I think it's a very good book for people who are interested in Irish history.
Yeah, and I can't believe I'm doing this, but I'm plugging. I think Ian Dale did the Irish Times podcast. It must have been last week.
Yeah, that's
So
right. And if I might just say as well, myself that on relation to Tichy, I am delighted to say that next year I'm going to be bringing out a book called Sean Lemass, The Lost Memoir, which is Sean Lemass's. Sean Lemass left 23 hours of recordings in the 1960s, which
Oh
is to
wow.
be his authorized biography, and it never happened. And those tapes of those transcripts have now been given to me, and I'm going to bring it in, produce it as a book next year. And many of your viewers will know Sean Lemass is basically the saviour of modern Ireland. He dragged the country from the depths of despair in the 1950s. And I think this is going to be an amazing memoir, because he's an amazing man, like he really is. And he's a guy of the highest intellectual quality.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to this coming out next year, I have to
Well,
say.
I tell you, Ron, you're a busy man. You get those, you get the books out. So I can tell you, it's not easy. You do, and of course, then you're still at the Irish Times doing your best. I don't think you've ever written anything in the Irish Times and I get angry. I save my anger for, Fintan O'Toole or something else. But
Yeah, okay.
never, very rarely, your good self. Ronan, I'm going to end, I don't know, hardly ever do this, but I think it's worth it, it's actually the penultimate paragraph from, it is Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, which I read a few years ago. I do really recommend people to, if they want to be thoroughly depressed. It is a fantastic book. And it reads, he fell in October 1918 on a day that was so quiet and still on the whole front that the army report confined itself to a single sentence: all quiet on the Western Front. Ronan McGreevy, thank you very much for your contribution today. It's been really amazing. Remembrance Sunday this Sunday and Armistice Day on Wednesday. It was an unnecessary war that changed the course of history.
Thank you so much, Laura, for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Ron.